I'm a member. Hello, my name is Tiaji Sio. I'm a member of the Diplomats of Color Network in the Federal Foreign Office. And on behalf of the Diplomats of Color Network and the Young German Council on Foreign Relations, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session as part of our monthly speaker series, Imagining a Foreign Policy with Equity at its Core. Today, we have a session on how we can move from Europolitanism towards an inclusive European identity and how we can include diverse perspectives. This session will be recorded and published. And without further ado, I give the floor to Merin Khan, EU correspondent for the Financial Times.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who is logged in this evening. My name is Merin. I'm, as was mentioned, one of the Brussels correspondents for the Financial Times, covering everything to do with EU policy. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to know that a network like German Diplomats of Color exists, because I have to be honest, I'm not sure I know about too many of them. And hopefully today we're going to have quite a broad and wide-ranging discussion. The title is From Europolitanism Towards an Inclusive European Identity. I'm going to start just by saying at the beginning, I'm not entirely sure what is meant by the term Europolitanism, but maybe some of our speakers can help unpack that particular phrase and help us towards articulating what a more inclusive European identity means. It's my pleasure to welcome three panelists today. We're going to start with Hans Kudnani, who is a fellow at Chatham House in London. Hans recently wrote a very provocative and thought-provoking essay in the New Statesman about the potentially exclusionary nature of pro-Europeanism and regionalism, as he called it. Hans is going to kick off with about a 10-minute sort of discussion item, and then we're going to bring in our fellow panelists to have a chat. And just right at the offset, I want to encourage people who are listening in to write in questions and raise points throughout the discussion, because hopefully we'll get through them as we're having a conversation and sort of pick up points that people want to hear about. So if you could do that in the Q&A chat function, I can see that, just write your name and where you're coming from. And that should help us sort of contribute to having a more lively chat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hans, who's going to open up with around 10 minutes or so with some ideas, which we're then going to get into the meat of. So Hans, welcome, and please go for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Merin. Really nice to be here. Really nice to see you all, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to explain what Europolitanism is either. I don't know what it is, but maybe someone else can. But what I'll try to do in sort of 10 minutes or so is just make a few sort of introductory remarks to kind of frame this set of questions. And I think maybe a good place to start is that, from my perspective as a Brit, I do find it quite difficult even to have this discussion in Germany with Germans. It seems to me that there is something particular about the way that Germans think about the Nazi past, which I think makes it quite difficult actually to have these conversations around race in particular. I mean, race in general, frankly, but race in particular in relation to the EU. The assumption, I think, among Germans is that the EU is sort of the opposite of all of the bad things in German history, and in particular, that it's somehow immune from racism, because that goes together with nationalism, and the EU is sort of post-nationalist or anti-nationalist, and so therefore you can't even put these two things together, racism and the EU. So I think there's a kind of a sort of an idealization of the EU, or sacralization, as some people have called it, that I think sort of closes off discussion and insulates the EU from critical interrogation. And the way that people like me that want to talk about these issues experience that is that it feels like there's a kind of a wall which we just can't get past to even have this conversation about the EU and race. So I want to suggest that a better way to think about the EU in this respect is not as the opposite of nationalism, but as a form of regionalism, as Merin was saying. It's not the opposite of nationalism at all. It's actually quite analogous to nationalism, regionalism, except on a larger scale. And what that means is that it can be progressive, it can be reactionary, it can be inclusive, it can be exclusive. For the purposes of this discussion, importantly, it can be ethnic or cultural, or it can be civic, in the same way that nationalism can be. And I think, so the sort of the other side of this is because Germany has had such a disastrous experience with the nation state, that Germans, I think, tend to think about nationalism also as being inherently bad, but it's not. And, actually to think of it in that way as inherently bad is rather Eurocentric, Germanocentric, perhaps. If you think, for example, of Indian nationalism, my father's Indian. If you think of Indian nationalism, this was a progressive anti-imperialist force, which I think illustrates that nationalism can be many different things. It isn't inherently a bad thing. And the same thing goes for regionalism. And if you think about it in that way, I think it opens up a space to have a conversation about the EU. In particular, what kind of regionalism is the EU? And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. So let me also just say a few things about sort of European identity, because these two things, the sort of EU and European identity, are so intertwined that I think it's important just to sort of pick them apart a little bit and think a little bit about this. So when somebody says I'm European, it seems to me that can mean three different things. The first is a statement of fact. I am from this geographical region called Europe. And in that sense, I have no problem calling myself European. I grew up in Britain, which is geographically part of Europe. I'm European, period. The other two versions of what it means when you say I'm European are a little different, I think, because they often go together with a certain kind of feeling of pride. And you'll hear people say, I'm a proud European. And I have to say, whenever people say that, I'm a proud European, I always wonder what they really mean by that. It seems to me it can be one of two different things. The first is a statement about ethnic or cultural or civilizational identity. And one example of this is if you think about, say, Pegida, they call themselves Europeans, right? They're proud Europeans too, but they're proud Europeans in the ethnic or cultural sense. The other meaning is a kind of a statement of support for the EU. So when you say I'm a proud European, what you're really saying is I believe in this project called the European Union, European integration. Now, these three meanings, particularly the last two, they get elided a lot. And I think that's really problematic. I think that pro-Europeans, in other words, people that support the EU, the European project, need to be very careful about which of those two meanings they mean when they say I'm a proud European. And even that phrase, the European project, or if you think in German, when you say Ich bin Europäer, I think it's even more clear how these things elide. Pro-Europeans aren't careful about this at all. They're extremely careless. They mix up these different meanings of what it means to say I'm European or I'm proud to be European. And this is really problematic, I think, because what happens, I think, is that this ethnic cultural meaning of Europeanness, this version of European identity, tends to slip in to statements that are actually about the EU. And again, I'll come back to that a little bit later on. So historically, I think it's fairly clear that being European meant being white. If I had time, I would talk about the original kind of the medieval period where the concept of Europe, being a European first gets used, and it's kind of more religious in the context of conflicts with Islam in particular, Islam as other. But in the modern period, what happens is that Europeanness really emerges at the same time and in very close connection with the idea of whiteness. This happens in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia and the Americas. And so what you have is this kind of European and white become almost synonymous. And I think it's worth stressing that this is not the case for national identities in Europe. If you think about what it means to be British or what it means to be German, that was never a synonym for white. There may have been an assumption that Germans were white, but it was never a synonym for whiteness in the way that European is, or was at least. And so if that's right, then I think the question becomes, to what extent did the European identity that emerged after 1945, that was attached to this thing that we call the European project, to what extent was that a break with this earlier identity, which is very closely connected to whiteness? And my answer to that question is, well, it wasn't as much of a break, and it wasn't as clean of a break as what pro-Europeans would like to think. And I don't have time to really get into this in a lot of detail, but just one example of this, if you go back to the beginning of the European project, the Treaty of Rome, when it was signed in 1957, 75% of the territory that it covered was outside of Europe. That was basically mainly Belgian and French colonies in West Africa. It included those territories. And to some extent, there's a fantastic book, which I can't recommend highly enough, called Eurafrica by Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson. Absolutely incredible book, which every pro-European should read, and very, very few pro-Europeans do read. It tells you this story of the end of the colonial period and how it intersects with the beginning of European integration. But more importantly, that for some of the founding fathers and early pro-Europeans, it was actually part of what the point of European integration was to consolidate Belgian and French colonies in West Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. And in particular, they wanted West German capital. They wanted an injection of West German capital. That was part of the point of European integration in that early period. I could spend a lot more time if I had it talking about this period. But what I think it illustrates is that the history is quite messy. That actually, the history of colonialism in that sort of the end of the period of colonialism, it intersects with the beginning of European integration. There isn't a clean break there at all. So what then happens after that? And again, as I say, this is a very long, sort of complicated story with all kinds of twists and turns, and I don't have time to really get into it. But I think that what happens is that, after the loss of those European colonies, France and Belgium lose those colonies fairly soon after the Treaty of Rome is signed, a more kind of civic regionalism emerges in the EU, the EEC, and then becomes the EU from the 1960s onwards. However, and this brings me back to my earlier point about the way in which the sort of ethnic and cultural version of European identity and the version that's a more civic version that's attached to the EU tend to kind of get elided. I think what happens is that the ethnic and cultural version is always kind of there in the background, and it can be mobilized by politicians, partly to get traction and to sell the European project. It's quite hard actually to sell this very technocratic project of governance. And so in order to give it pathos, what pro-Europeans tend to do is they draw on this more ethnic cultural identity to kind of talk about Europe. And they bring in these kind of civilizational kind of tropes. And my argument, which I made in the essay that Mehreen mentioned at the beginning, is that since 2010, and in particular since the refugee crisis in 2015, these civilizational tropes have become much more powerful within the EU. There's been what I call a civilizational turn in the European project. Or to put it a different way, the civic regionalism of the EU is giving way to a more ethnic or cultural regionalism. You see this particularly in EU migration policy since 2005. It's not just that it's totally brutal in a way that is virtually indistinguishable from what Donald Trump was doing in the United States when he was president, but it's the way that it's framed. The fact that you now have a European Commissioner for protecting the European way of life, whose job is to keep out migrants. It makes this civilizational thing completely explicit. Migrants are a threat to the European way of life. It could not be more explicit than that. And this sort of brings me back to where I started, and this is where I'll finish, which is that I think some pro-Europeans just simply can't see this. They can't see that it's problematic to talk about a European way of life in this way, because they think the EU is somehow immune from these kinds of problematic kind of tropes. Some, I think, do get it, and this is even more problematic, I think. They get it, but they're unwilling to criticize other pro-Europeans. They tend to close ranks because they see this battle between the pro-Europeans and the Eurosceptics. I think, and this is where I'll end, it's really, really important that pro-Europeans who don't believe in this civilizational version of the EU that they call out these tropes when they see them. When Macron, for example, uses these tropes, or when there is a new commissioner for protecting the European way of life, they speak out, they criticize other pro-Europeans instead of closing ranks with them. And so that's really my plea to pro-Europeans in Germany is you need to call these things out. Otherwise, what happens is this will contaminate the European project. And I think the civic version of regionalism, I think then is completely gone.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hans, very much. That was an excellent exposition, I think, of lots of the themes that you put out in your essay. I mean, for anyone who's not familiar, I think the essay is called The Meaning of Pro-Europeanism. It was published online by the New Statesman around February. I think if you Google Hans's name, you can definitely find it. And I would encourage everyone to read it, because it's also generated some responses, including from some columnists at the Financial Times, like Martin Sambu. I think Mark Leonard also replied to it. And it's, at least I think, been a very welcome step to having a conversation about an issue which, I mean, I've been in Brussels for 4 or 5 years, and I find it remarkable that, as you mentioned, like the German context, people in Brussels don't even have the vernacular to talk about issues like race and where diversity comes to mean a very specific thing. I think the link has just been put in the chat as well, so anyone who's on the chat can click. It's a shame that we don't have anyone on the panel here from the centre-right. I think it would have been interesting to maybe get a perspective of the pro-European centre-right, which I think have been most guilty of co-opting some of the tropes that Hans mentioned. However, it's my pleasure to welcome Katerina Barley to the panel, particularly because she has stepped in at the last minute to replace the German Europe Minister. Katerina has been an MEP in Brussels in the new EU mandate, which was elected in 2019. She is a member of the German SPD and served as the Justice Minister in the German cabinet before arriving in Brussels. Katerina, thank you so much for joining us. I think initially what I would like you to do is perhaps respond to some of the questions thrown out by Hans, in particular, whether you also feel, or how you feel about the fact that pro-Europeans do have a responsibility to confront, I think, some of the darker tendencies and perhaps the most long-standing part of European identity, which predates the European Union and was developed as a civilizational identity. The fact that these historical issues, I think the reason they're not confronted is, one, because of the historical illiteracy of lots of people who claim to be pro-European. I don't think they really know too much about the history of how the colonial projects infected the beginnings of the European Union, or the more long-standing ideas of how Europe was born in contradiction, or at least defined as the areas that it was not, like North Africa, other parts of the East. Katerina, can you give us your perspective on some of the things thrown out by Hans, particularly on this historical burden, which not too many people, as far as I can see anyway, are having conversations about, particularly those who identify as pro-European?
Well, thank you very much for all of this input. Yes, I stepped in I think 12 hours ago, so I didn't really have the time to prepare. And I'm just going to give you a few thoughts on what Hans just said, being half German and half British myself. So I think I can give some of the German perspective that you touched upon, the historical burden, but also maybe the European. And even if I don't know if it's appropriate, because you're such an expert and I haven't, I've spent 12 hours preparing this, but I would just like to question a few things, maybe so that you can elaborate further on them. First of all, I'm always a bit irritated when the title of Commissioner Skinas is being mentioned, because yes, it was proposed to be called Protection of the European Way of Life, but we as a European Parliament objected heavily to this for exactly the reasons that Hans mentioned, and he has not called this. We ended up in promoting the European way of life, which is still not perfect, which is not what we wanted, absolutely, because you still define a European way of life. But of course, this protecting has a threat in it. So someone is threatening it. And this was exactly what we had very, very heavy and long discussions on. So I just want to say that there is an awareness of what is going on in trying to define being European as something that is supposed to be a closed model, that people are not supposed to enter. Now you can say, if you do it the other way around, saying promoting the European way of life, it's kind of trying to bring everything good in European way of life to other places in the world, which could raise questions too. But as I said, it was not what the European Parliament wanted to achieve, but definitely this concept of protecting the European life was something that was heavily objected. I would also like yes, you mentioned India and the nation being something unifying. We in Germany have this experience too. Previous to the horrific experience of the Nazi regime, we were not a country. We were a place with hundreds of very small. How do you call them in English? Well, where counts and dukes and whoever reigned, and the concept of nationalism was something very progressive. The Hambacher Schloss was kind of the starting point of the German nation, and it was seen as something very progressive. Students and a lot of foreigners, by the way, Poles and French people were there to help promote this. This unifying, this nationalism, but still saying that German was never a synonym for white. Now, I'm white myself, so I may be not the one to judge upon this, but what my colored friends tell me is that they very often are confronted with this question, but where do you come from? From Heidelberg. But where do you really come from? So I'm not so sure if this is the reality in Germany, that if you I think even maybe less than in other European countries, because Germany did entered this terrible market of colonialization, if one might call it this way, very late. Had few colonies for a short period of time. So we do not have. In following up of this, we didn't have the same multi-ethnicity that, for example, Great Britain, the UK had, or France had for other reasons also later. So I think for many German people, if we say we are Europeans, I think it might imply a higher amount of multi-ethnicity than if you say I'm a proud German. Because it includes countries. Being European includes not UK politically anymore, sorry to say, but still geographically includes countries that have a much higher degree of multi-ethnicity. So I absolutely share what you said about the contrast being a proud European and being a proud sort of EU citizen. But this is also a political debate that is, well, debate. It is a political fight that is going on in Germany, because these Pegida people, they make a political point about saying Europe is not the European Union and vice versa. So it's them actually who try to distinguish this, having in mind that that most people in Germany feel European and think this is something positive, and they want to claim the positive part and kind of separate the technocratic, cold, expensive part of the European Union from this. And this is one of the reasons why actually a lot of pro-European politicians use this very actively in saying, no, we're not only proud EU citizens, we're also proud Europeans, because it implies more than, you know, we do not want to leave this notion to those who try to use it in an excluding way, as you just described it. So we are actually trying to reconquer this notion, Europe, from these people who try to give it this excluding touch. So I think I might leave it here, saying one thing I would like to add, because I'm not sure how many people are going to take the German perspective. So I just wanted to add that we are at the moment having this very intense discussion on Article 3, on the notion of what we had on race, on the notion of race in our constitution, which was actually found not being appropriate because it reminds so much of the Nazi as pseudo-scientists. But in the political debate, we did face the problem, well, we don't want to call it race, but of course it's racism. So we can't and we don't want to find a different word for racism. So this still, it shows probably the very ambiguous heritage that we have in Germany, absolutely. And also if you see the difficulties on the one hand, that we do not want to, for example, have statistics who is of which ethnicity, and on the other hand, we would need them to combat racism. So we have a lot of dilemmas and ambiguities because of our past. That is absolutely true. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'm going to listen very, very closely and attentively to further discussion, because I think we really need to learn, and we probably need to learn from people who come from nations that are less, that have a less burdened history there.
Sure.
Maybe
Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, maybe I'll just plant the idea in your head, but I think talking about the German context is very interesting. But obviously, if you're here as an MEP and you represent your political group, I think perhaps later on in the discussion, it'll be interesting, I think, to move the focus away from just how populists and anti-Europeans have a narrative about the European Union, which is exclusionary. And actually, for me, what is more prescient to talk about is how avowedly pro-European, often governments, centre-left, liberal, centre-right, also use the same rhetoric, particularly on issues like, you know, the extension of Turkey's accession to the European Union, migration policy, and counter-terrorism. And there are very clear examples of particularly very peculiar and I guess taken a historical break to what people who define themselves as progressive would do on things like migration. So that might be an issue to come back to. But I want to bring our next panelist and final panelist into the discussion, so we can have everyone. Abula, who's the coordinator for the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. And I think we already mentioned Heidelberg, but I think that's where she's based. And maybe perhaps everyone, you could give us your reaction to what Hans has been talking about, and also perhaps in your opening remarks, an introduction to what you do.
Yes, of course. I hope I got everything
at the coalition, and particularly if you think that the sort of metropolitan or this. Oh, Sorry, can you hear me?
I think your internet is stuck a bit, so I hear only parts of your sentences, but I think I got more or less what you said.
Basically, yes, just for your reaction to Hans and perhaps some of your work as the coordinator at the coalition, and what you guys do and what sort of perspective it's given you, not only particularly on Germany, but perhaps other metropolitan centers outside Germany too.
Of course, yeah. So thank you for the invitation. I have already like 3 pages of notes for reaction to what has been said. But maybe I'll try to first start with the work we do at the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. So we are a network of more or less 150 cities all across Europe. And what we try to do is build a platform for exchange and to facilitate exchange and to connect on a European level, to think about how we can shape European cities as more inclusive and diverse, and to create, in the end, cities for all of us. And I think it's quite interesting, of course, because it connects well to what Hans said, the regional and the local level, because in the end, cities are the places where diversity is lived in many cities in Europe already. So many different races and ethnicities live together, and cities have a lot of expertise on how to deal with that and what the local level can actually do. And especially in times when on a national level and on the EU level, we have struggles with populists, or the right, I think it's very crucial that we hear and acknowledge the voices and perspectives of cities, because there the political situation a lot of times is very, very different. And I think like I can resonate a lot to what Hans said when we're talking about the regional identity, because in the end, this is what our cities try to do and try to work for. But of course, within our city network, we can also see the differences in the different cities and in the different nations, right? So we have cities coming from Poland, for example, but also we have French cities, we have German cities. So the discourse around racism and what to do to tackle it is very, very different. And I think within our network of people that work on a local level, sometimes it is more easy to exchange on what could be done to create a more diverse Europe. So I think this for the work we do. And so I'll try to react to what has been said, which isn't that easy. I'll try to start with Katharina Barley, because I slightly would disagree on certain things you said about the German context, right? Because I think especially Black history and people of color are part of Germany since a very long time already. And the question always is who defines the narrative? And I think this question we can also transfer to the European level, who defines what European identity is and who's visible within the European Union, what people are working there, whose interests are represented there. So I think when we're talking about identity, a lot of times we should think of who created the power structures behind these identities and who shaped the narrative. And I think in Germany, we see that this narrative was shaped by white persons. And I think a lot of times it's been said like, Germany, the colonial history, it's not too bad because it was very short, but still I think there was the genocide of the and Nam, and I think it was just recently acknowledged. So I think it's also in Germany, you can see that the narrative is on the way to change, but not yet there. And I think also coming from a German perspective, a lot of times discussing issues around racism, we talk about identity politics and the fight around identity in Germany and German identity. And I think Emilia Roig stated this very accurately in her talk at the Republika, that in the end, identity politics is about liberation movements. And I think it's a quite interesting way also to see European identity and who is being liberated and whose liberation is also the EU fighting for. So I think we, at least as a network of cities, we try to really work on the ground to see what is happening there, what are the concerns of activists, and what can we as cities do when we try to connect that to European level. What we see, of course, is the first European anti-racism action plan that was launched last year by the Commission, which I think is a historic step. And especially there, cities and the local perspective have been mentioned to actually implement the policies that the anti-racism action plan wants to see. So I think we shouldn't forget about the voices and the perspectives of cities in this context, and also the power cities have to reshape the narrative and to build new narrative, because realities are very different in cities. So I think I leave it there for now. Yeah, maybe one thing to add, we've been talking a lot, or I think Katharina Barley mentioned it, to data. And this is what we see on a local level, but also on an EU level, is to make representation happen and to be more inclusive, you first of all also have to see what is happening, who's being discriminated, why, who's discriminating. And I think the issue of equality data is very, very crucial. And also there, we as ECHA, we created a 10-point plan of action as a tool to measure what cities are doing in their fight against racism. And we see how useful it is to make this more visible. Because in the chat, I think I saw this question on what concrete next steps political decision makers can take. And I think, of course, representation is very crucial to shape a European identity that is more inclusive. And I think for representation, it is important to all these concepts of power sharing and to give space to really do that and to not only talk about it. And I think equality data is very helpful and necessary because it shows certain things. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, just on that point, I think as a journalist, I know speaking to fellow journalists who struggle so much to write stories about the prevalence or of discrimination in their countries, particularly in Francophone countries in Germany, because there is no data in which they can accurately have officially. So a bit like Hans, I'm from a British background where we have a census, which does give you the very basic level of population data about people who identify as certain religions, certain ethnicities, and from that, of course, you would ideally, a bit like how we've managed to talk about issues like the gender pay gap, basically have an empirical basis on which you can say, yes, there are acute problems in these labour markets sectors, for example, and therefore that's how we, and then we should design policies around how to reduce this sort of stuff. But in Europe, in Western Europe particularly, conversations about racism seem to be evidence-free places. You can basically make whatever claims you like about the absence or the presence of discrimination without any sort of empirical data. And I think it's a huge hindrance to having, well, at least in my line of work, just, reporting around these issues. Maybe now I'll come back. I want to come to the issue of how I think progressive parties, progressive pro-European parties struggle talking about race. And I think, Evie, you mentioned also the idea of identity politics. And it seems that particularly parties on the left are very wary of being accused of playing culture wars or accused of being the woke police or accused of being social justice warriors by the right. And this is a narrative, a very powerful narrative that the right uses, and one which I think the left and the progressive left is struggling to counter. Katharina Barley, maybe we can come to you as somebody who's obviously in the SPD family and also the European Socialists and Democrats. Do you see, is there a fight intellectually within your group and within your political party about how to design these narratives? And also we do, like I mentioned previously, have examples of avowedly pro-European centre-left governments in Europe who are promoting policies of systemic discrimination against their own people of colour. I mentioned Denmark. I also mentioned migration policy in other parts. In France, we have a new buzzwords about separatism, which is basically, trying to identify, fifth columnism amongst people who are French citizens rather than migrants. Why is the left struggling so much to come up with a counter narrative, an inclusive counter narrative to the provocations of the right? And two, why is there also, I think, as Hans mentioned, this sort of conspiracy of silence to call out this stuff when it happens among pro-Europeans? And surely by this conspiracy of silence is just playing into the hands of people who are always going to beat you around the head with the fact that you're not, you don't care enough about European identity or your soft on issues of European purity, borders, and all the rest of it. I mean, what is the conversation that people in the left are having about these issues?
Now, if I speak for SND, I mean the left progressive parties is more than SND. But if you have a look at them, they are very, very different throughout Europe in a lot of respects. And yes, they have. I haven't followed this long enough, I would say, to be absolutely sure if this is correct. But I would say probably since 2015-16, it has become even more diverse than it has been before. I think this, as I said, I've been a national politician for a very long time. And I'm in the European context since 2019. So, but this is my perception. Yes, of course, we discuss about that. I mean, the youngest Danish law has not received any applause from especially the German SPD, and we have been very critical about that, and also said so. And again, if I take my national party, I mean, I would not say that we have people who think that the issue itself is not justified, or that we should not take care of it. That is now for the German SPD. There are parts of my party, and I think also of other European parties, that let themselves be. No, I start the other way around. The critics is that you get if you stand up for the rights of people of color or for LGBTI people, etc., is you care about the minorities, but you do not care about what the majority of people are worried about, and that goes hand in hand with a in a lot of European countries, with progressive parties losing parts of the electorate. And I think there are parts of the parties who actually think, wow, now we have lost a lot of voters, and we should focus on the whatever, in our case, working class problems, etc. I do not belong to this group, and I really want to say this, because I never ever said that the German colonial history was not so bad. This was not at all what I wanted to say. I just wanted to say the number of people, the percentage of people of color in Germany because of the colonization was lower than, for example, in the UK or in France, and therefore opening towards Europe meant, at least in some countries, more opening towards more multi-ethnicity. That was just my point. So, okay. Now I'm myself, I'm a member of the anti-racism and diversity intergroup in the European Parliament. So we have these cross political party bodies where actually all the people come together that want to engage for these purposes. And I find it difficult to explain, because it's not my opinion. But if I should try to explain it, it's because of what I said. It's a combination of a downslide in the of votes. Or a threat. I think for the case of Denmark, I think it might be, I have to really be hypothetical here, the perception that by taking this stand, the political support has risen, and that's probably why they do it. But I don't know. I mean, we have this discussion. We do say that we do not share this view as German Social Democrats when it comes to the European way, and a lot of others do this too. And within our own party, I would say it's by far a minority who thinks that way. We had this public discussion with a few of our older members who got involved in a very unfruitful discussion there. And there was the vast majority of people who said, look, it has always been, since 150 years, our position to fight for human rights. And the rights of people of color who live in Germany are human rights. So there's no question where we stand. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I think, yeah, I can see obviously you're grappling with this, and maybe I'm going to come to Hans because I could see him struggling and responding in some parts, but it, just from my perspective, it looks like everyone in the political spectrum has imbibed this idea that when you fight for the rights of minorities, that it's a zero-sum game, and if minorities are given rights, that means the majority, or the mythical white majority, lose out. So that's how now we've kind of that's what identity politics seems to have become, a game where there's always, if some side is going to win, then that means naturally some you have to lose. And I think the failure of progressive parties is to develop a narrative, a progressive narrative around the rights of all working people, not to define them by their race, and to create an identity where there is,
I mean, this is
where
so
there
obvious.
is net gains for everyone involved and a net gain for society. Yes, but I mean, it is so obvious, but the problems the left seem to be having is that they feel under attack if they fight for the rights of some minorities, because the backlash narrative is that means the host community is going to lose out. And I think if that's the starting point for so many of these discussions, which sadly it is, it's very difficult for the progressives to win. Hans, I want to give you the floor just to respond to some of the things that Katrina has said, and also I want to just bring in some of the comments that we have. Shaheen mentions the fact that we have obviously spoken about the German context and perhaps the peculiarities, the historical peculiarities of why developing this kind of narrative in Germany is difficult. But he points out rightly, I think, and he says that countries with an even more diverse past like France are not necessarily better positions to produce this sort of more inclusive discourse. He says that France is held back by the undigested history of colonialism, imperialism, and has a poor record of dealing with religions in general and Islam in particular. So, and I think you mentioned that in your essay, this is by no means just something where Germany's historical baggage makes it not very equipped to have these conversations. This historical reckoning, particularly with the legacy of colonialism throughout Europe, Western Europe in particular, is not something that we seem to have had conversations about. So maybe you can speak to that point. And also there's another question which is directly at you from Tugberk Samuel, who's from Turkey and says, thank you for this event. I have a question to Hans. What about Turkish people in Turkey who consider themselves European and pro-European? Some people in Turkey consider themselves as European, but others not. Will we still identify the EU, I think he means, to some extent with whiteness? I think it's probably uncontroversial to say that Turkey is, for hundreds of years, been the litmus test of how far we can push European identity, given how the issue of Turkey rallies people, whether it's current day Turkey or whether it was the Ottomans back in the day, to define the very strict limits of who we can consider to be.
Thanks, Mehreen. So yes, actually, it's funny you mentioned Turkey, because I wanted to talk about not so much Turkish people in Turkey, but Turkish people in Germany, actually. And this goes to this point that Katarina made about how, somehow Germany sort of, I think the phrase you used was that didn't have the same, the UK had a higher degree of ethnicity, I think was the way you put it, or a higher degree of multi-ethnicity. I think this is just wrong, and I think it's really important to correct this. The post-war experiences of Britain, France, and Germany in terms of immigration, very, very similar. The only difference is that because of the different colonial history that we've mentioned, in Germany, those immigrants, West Germany, those immigrants didn't come from former colonies, they came from Turkey and other countries, but above all from Turkey. If you look at the numbers, and if you look at the role they played in the German economy, the discrimination they faced, it's exactly the same. The only difference is you didn't have that strong colonial link, and so they come from a different place. But it's exactly the same story. And so I think it's just wrong to sort of suggest somehow Germany was starting from, a much sort of, a different place in terms of, not being as kind of multicultural. It was from exactly the same moment that Britain became, had mass immigration. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, because I think this is a kind of a blind spot in the German discourse. And I was reminded of this last summer when, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, everybody was trying to figure out, well, what does this mean for Europe, right? And I remember Heiko Maas, your party colleague, in his statement, talking about Black Germans and talking about Jewish Germans, and not saying a word about Turkish Germans. It simply didn't appear to occur to him that actually the equivalent of the large non-white populations that experience racism that you have in Britain and France, the equivalent of that in Germany is the Turkish Germans. And it simply didn't occur to him to even say anything about it. So I think it's really important to sort of get over this idea that somehow, Germany, there is a certain kind of exonerating kind of logic here, which is that, yes, we have to catch up. We're not starting from the same place as Britain and France, so cut us some slack. This is just, I think this is a delusion about Germany. The second thing I wanted to say, which is important, is on this question of European way of life. I mean, I'm sorry, but you've slightly missed the point here. The point is not whether it's protecting or promoting. And by the way, I think at the beginning it was defending was the original suggestion, but none of that matters. All that matters is you have this phrase, the European way of life, and it's the name of a commissioner whose job is to keep migrants out. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter whether you say promoting or not. The point is you're making a connection between the European way of life and migration, and suggesting that somehow to protect or promote or defend the European way of life, you have to keep migrants out. That is the explicit civilizational implication. So it doesn't matter how you what verb you put in front of that. And again, this sort of comes back to my point about how it does seem as if sometimes pro-Europeans can't see that these things are problematic, and they're sort of missing the point about what's problematic about it. And then let me finally just make another sort of clarification on this question around what I said about Europeanness being a synonym for whiteness. I'm making a historical point here, which is that it was never the case that German was a synonym for being white, because there were other white countries. So, for example, if you think about British identity or you think about German identity, all of the European national identities were formed in opposition to other European nations. German nationalism is very clear. It forms in opposition to France, right? The same with Britain, by the way, it forms in opposition to France. So the other, so social scientists will talk about constitutive outsiders, and that's the other against which you form your own identity. So what it means to be European is defined against what it means to not be European. In the same way, what it means to be German, the only way you have a conception about what it means to be German is to define it against something that's not German. And historically, it was the case that every European country defined its national identity against other white countries. So there's no possible way in which German could be a synonym for being European. However, whiteness is virtually historically a synonym for European. And if you don't believe me, read the last chapter of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, or any of these pieces from this period, where they talk about Europeans and what they mean is white people. And that's from 1968, I think. So it's relatively recent. It's in the post-war period. That was, it's a completely different story in terms of identity formation. That's the point I was trying to make. And then, yeah, maybe I'll stop there for the moment. I could say something about Turkish succession. I think you've kind of said it already, Mehreen. So yeah, I won't add anything more at the moment.
Thank you, and thank you for raising those points. I mean, I think I tweeted something yesterday about Frans Timmermans, who did an essay in Die Welt, very eloquent and I think considered essay, where he sort of tries to find the roots and tries to find the symptoms of this excluding European identity, and saying how it's always kind of been around. But the examples he uses of why it's so dangerous, he mentions anti-Semitism in Europe, which is on the rise, and homophobia in Europe. But he does not mention at all racism in Europe, racism against Europeans, not people who are migrants. And I think maybe, Evian, you can also talk to this point, because I know we have a sort of German-speaking panel here. But one of the things I find quite strange is that in this inability of people in Europe, people in Western Europe to speak about race is how we talk about people of color. And I think, Hans, you've mentioned this to me before, but the German phrase people of migrant background is I think its origins are in German. I'm not familiar with German, but I think it comes from German, but it's also now something that is used very commonly, particularly in EU and Brussels world, to define people. And you know, I'm just going to say personally, I think it's a really problematic phrase to call people people of migrant background, because it means, you know, I don't know how many generations back you have to be a person of migrant background, but it's a very crude way of referring to someone who's not white, basically. I mean, most Europeans are all of migrant background, but it's just some certain migrants that we decide not to. So maybe you could speak about the language point, particularly when you're doing your work in and around cities, and I guess educating people around issues of diversity. I mean, there are probably people who are listening who feel like it's not politically correct to use some sorts of words, and language is obviously very important in this discourse. So maybe you can speak on that point. And then after you've done that, there's a question about, we've had a very Western European debate. There's also a question about Eastern Europe and the experiences of Eastern Europe, which maybe we can come back to. So I'll let you.
Yeah, I'll try, but I'm also very.
On the first.
Of course. So I think in Germany, we have a very rich debate on wordings and what wordings to use, right? And I think probably in this round, we would all agree that naming is power. And in the end, part of racism is to define a narrative and to make one the other and to call him names. And I think you've been asking to how many generations you have to, your family had to migrate. I think it's 2 officially to have a migration background, sometimes 3. But I think also the communities of color in Germany try to find their own words, right? So for example, the word Afro-Deutsch, like Afro-German, started in the 80s, where the Black German movement started. But also, for example, we have like the word people of color, but in the end, it's an English word, right? Why? Because in German, the word color has a very different root, which is a racist root. So you cannot just translate it. And I think when it especially comes to people with Turkish migration history. So I think there are several terms, right? Migration history, international biography, but also there's this idea to reclaim certain words like Kanake, which in the end is also a racist term, but very young 2nd and 3rd generations are using it to reclaim it and to be proud about it. So I think this ongoing debate in Germany, it's really, really symbolic on how the whole feuilleton is full of how hard it is for the language to become more inclusive. And I think from a city point of view, this is also very interesting. Because what we see within the ECHR is that, of course, cities try to develop certain standards, how you use inclusive language, what to do about it. And they're like city, in the end, it's a very diverse employer, right? Very different kinds of people work in city administrations. So it's quite interesting to see what cities try to do when it comes to different wordings, because you have to explain it in a way that also, well, that is quite understandable also for people not affected by racism. So what we see is the example of the city of Cologne, which I think is very interesting. They published a document, they call it Guidelines for Respectful Communication, because in the end, I think it's a lot about respecting each other and not to constantly think that it's very important to have the right to discriminate a person via wordings, right? So I think their cities have very crucial roles, because they so we have here our local Black Lives Matter groups, for example, and also several parties in the city council. They wrote a proposal to the city council asking to not use the N-word anymore in debates. So of course, there was a very, very big debate ongoing in the city council. Of course, especially AfD had a very loud voice there, but in the end it got accepted and the N-word got banned, and now it's on the city administrations to develop guidelines to see how can we actually implement that. And I think it's the same when you see the very strong activist movement on the street and what they ask us for. I think then it's very fast that cities are the first institution they refer to, with a lot of power in the end to locally act and react. And I think it starts when cities think on what words do we use in our official publications do we use pronouns? Do we use gender stars? So I think when we're talking about language, of course, it's not only about racism, it's also about other forms of discrimination. And I think this debate for me as like a second generation person with migrant background, I'm from Bavaria, like it's very German there. And I know this question very well, and like, where are you from? And I think at some point, it's very sad to constantly read these debates on language that take people's rights in the end, right? Because to see how important it seems to be for certain people to use words and to not be able to let go of words, I think it's very symbolic for this whole debate on identity politics. And I think a good example is always, it's like, it's not a cake, right? It doesn't mean that you get less if other people also get rights. You don't use your language just if other people want to be addressed respectfully. And I think this is quite interesting also when it comes to the European perspective, talking about the term Afropean, right? Which is a word that many Black persons living in Europe probably wouldn't use, because it's not so, I wouldn't identify myself as Afropean necessarily, but I think it's a word that tries to make visible the Black experience in Europe, right? And I think if we talk about diversifying Europe and its identity, I think it's also about trying to give words to the experience people of color make in Europe. And I think there aren't enough. And I think maybe Afropean also can be like a start in the end to give space to another European perspective, because as I said, like Black people are part of Europe since a very long time already. Yeah, so I think that's it regarding language.
Yeah, you touched on the idea of why it's a zero-sum game, like, you know, the cake analogy, and just to reference a couple of things that have been happening in Britain recently with taking the knee and footballers taking the knee. It's basically caused an uproar, including among conservative politicians, some of whom have compared taking the knee to doing a Nazi salute. And I think it refers to your idea, as you said, that when you ask some people not to use a word, they take it as a personal assault, that their liberties are somehow being impinged upon because everyone's becoming politically correct. And I think the taking the knee debate has become so toxic in the UK now, because people feel just by seeing the act of someone take a knee that it's somehow impinging against their rights. So they boo it and they want it to be banned. So this is a sort of farcical world that we've ended up in, where I think it's probably because somehow there is a majority, or there's people tapping into a majoritarian feeling where they think that, well, if people are going to start taking the knee and protesting for Black Lives Matter, that means other lives don't matter. And, you know, this is such a basic debate, but sadly that's why we're there. There's one question here which I'm going to open up to everyone who wants to answer, and it's about Eastern Europe. And Rohat, who mentions that we have given Eastern European areas a bit less attention in this debate, and the question is, which role could engagement with Eastern European histories and narratives play for an inclusive European self-awareness? Also in view of European-Russian conflict lines, or strengthening of a common European democratic consciousness, considering struggles for democracy such as in Poland or Hungary. I don't know who wants to go for this, but maybe my comment would be, if we're speaking about European identity as whiteness, there is the specifics of Eastern European history. Of course, these countries were not involved in colonialism. They were actually suffered under colonialism of a different nature, which of course was the Soviet Union. But I mean, does anyone have any opinions about how, in some sense, I imagine European history has become more inclusive to include Eastern Europe, to include the Orthodox world, which was also historically not ever considered to be real Europe by when Europe was under predominantly Catholic and Protestant range. But can Eastern Europe give us any lessons about how to manage more inclusive populations and how to expand the definitions of Europe? Does anyone want to come in?
I can have a go at that if you want.
Sure.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's clearly true that there's so much complexity because every country in Europe has a different history, and in particular a different history in relation to colonialism. As you mentioned, there are some that are former colonial powers. By the way, there are some that are former colonial powers outside of Europe, and some that had their sort of imperial aspirations within Europe. Then there are some that were themselves colonies. I think if you look at the sort of history of sort of memory politics in the European Union, and this is, very sort of reductive, but broadly, what you have is this incredibly, the collective memory of the Holocaust becomes, incredibly powerful in Europe from the sort of late 60s onwards, to the point where it becomes so integrated into the founding myth of the European Union. It becomes really, really central. The collective memory of colonialism, imperialism is completely absent from this narrative of the European project. Then what happens after the end of the Cold War is that because of the accession of Central and Eastern European countries, the collective memory of Stalinism also becomes, sort of incorporated into the sort of European narrative. But the sort of colonial and imperial history sort of remains pretty much marginalized. And it's sort of complicated because I think, on the one hand, it's true that some Central and Eastern European countries don't have the same history of empire beyond Europe that France and Belgium and the Netherlands do, or the UK. But at the same time, I think we have to admit that part of what's happened in Europe in the last few decades since the accession of Central and Eastern European countries, and this I think is part of the story I was trying to tell about what's going on in the EU right now with the civilizational turn around migration issues and so on, is that some of these ideas, civilizational ideas of, the Christian Europe, have sort of partly become stronger in the EU, partly because of the presence of countries like Poland and Hungary. And I think what has happened, and this goes to this discussion, Mehreen, that you were just having with Katharina about social democrats. I think that, it's fairly simple. What's happened is that, Europe has turned to the right. The far right has become, electorally very, very powerful. Social democrats can see that, and they're trying to get those votes by using many of the same tropes. And I think where the blind spot comes in is that they often can't see that they're using the same tropes, because they say, well, the far right is Eurosceptic and we're pro-European, so they can't be the same tropes. Often they are, and so, the question I sort of sometimes ask myself is, sometimes I do have the feeling that some pro-Europeans, particularly social democrats, that the only real problem they have with the far right is that the far right is Eurosceptic, not that it has these far right tropes, right? So I think that's part of it. And then one final point on this Eastern Europe stuff, which sort of links to the question about Turkish accession that you touched on earlier. I think it is very, very striking if you look back at the sort of history of the EU and the contrast between the way that after the end of the Cold War, Central and Eastern European countries were able to accede to the European Union, were welcomed into the European Union relatively quickly. And there was this whole idea of a return to Europe. You contrast that with what happens after the Arab Spring in 2011, when there's never any prospect of North African countries, regardless of what reforms they would have undertaken, there's never any prospect of them joining the European Union at any point. So in some ways, you talked a bit about Turkey as the kind of litmus test here, but I think there are some other even more interesting cases. One is that, Morocco in 1987 applied to join the European Union, was flatly refused for, basically on the grounds that it doesn't belong to Europe, whatever, reforms it undertakes, as I mentioned. And then similarly, as I say, the countries of North Africa after the Arab Spring, they had no prospect of ever joining the European Union. And to me, that sort of underlines the kind of civilizational component of, pro-European identity. It's not, pro-Europeans would like to say, well, this is a universal project, anybody can join this, but that's clearly not the case.
Eva, do you want to come in? You put your hand up.
Yeah, I think on two things. So I think we're talking a lot about whiteness and race, but I think we shouldn't forget also about intersectionality, right? Because people never are only white. And I think when talking about Europe or situations in Eastern European countries, it's not only about whiteness, it's also about other identity layers. And I think to create like a different European identity, or to come back to visions for a European future, we should also include a more intersectional perspective and other identity layers. So this is the point I wanted to make when talking about Eastern Europe, and just to see the multiple layers of identities and Europeans, whomever this may be, face, because I really missed that. And one other thing I missed, and also a question I would have, if I may, to my two colleagues is actually more towards the future, right? Because I feel we've been a lot analyzing the past, which I think is really crucial to understand these issues and to develop visions for the future. But I would be actually very curious also to hear now that we analyze that there is an issue, what can be actually done and who's responsible to do it and what changes need to be made. Because at least this is what is interesting for me as a Black person living in Europe. This is what I'm interested in, because I somehow plan to stay here and to shape also Europe in a way that I see myself represented within. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think it's very crucial to become concrete here, to see what is it that needs to be done, who is doing it and who not. And so this is just something I would be very curious to hear, because I think this is where at least for me, the perspective of cities again comes in. That is quite interesting because they do a lot of work on the ground. But I'm sorry, Mehran, to ask a question, but for me, I've
Katrina,
been like...
I think,
Katrina,
I think you can jump in. And also just maybe on that point of intersectionality, I'm very glad that you raised this point, because intersectionality is also under attack in Western Europe. It's particularly under attack in countries like France, who've considered it to be an American import. So universities and higher education in France are coming under attack by the government for promoting these dangerous ideas about intersectionality. So maybe, Katrina, you could speak to that point, and also to Evian's point about what happens now and what is the way forward for people like yourselves and policymakers on how to grapple with some of the things that we've mentioned.
Yes, thank you, because actually intersectional approach was one of the notes that I made for myself also, because it's important, especially when it comes to looking at Eastern Europe. Now, I've fought all my life for human rights and rule of law and democracy. So please understand that I'm at the moment extremely critical when it comes to some countries in not countries, but governments in Eastern Europe. And I wanted to highlight that this is not by accident that there are multiple groups under attack, especially in countries like Poland and Hungary. But it is a coordinated, long, ongoing narrative, a network that is worldwide, that had its roots in 1960 in South America. And that we now see, for example, in Poland, when you look at this organization called Ordo Juris. I hope you've all heard of that and know what it's about, because these are people, academics, who have it's kind of a think tank, people who I don't believe they're really actually interested in fighting people of color or homosexual people or whoever, but they actually use it as a vehicle to gain power. So this is a school that, as I said, dates back from 1960 and has, I mean, it's like it's a bit in the Steve Bannon direction. And this Ordo Juris school, they're infiltrating not only Europe and European organizations, but for example, the top person on the list, on the Polish list for the European Court of Human Rights, was one of the top heads of Ordo Juris. But they have already infiltrated some organizations of the United Nations. So these are really people who have an agenda. They have an agenda of fighting strong women, LGBTI people, and ethnic minorities. And they do that in a very coordinated way. So coming back to Evan's question, what can we do against that? We have to see this as I mean, they don't do this because they had an unhappy childhood or because they had problems with their mother or whatever. This is strategic. So we have to address this in the same strategic way. So the first thing we should stop doing is fighting against each other. I mean, we see that every now and again. We see trans people versus homosexual people. We see, but religious or ethnic minorities that happens. We see left people against people who are not left enough. And I just have to say this, I'm sorry, the European way of life, I focused, I answered to you saying, Hans, that there was no discussion about this. There has been an extremely lively discussion. And if you follow it, you will see that the complete left half of the European Parliament, including all socialists and democrats, have put up exactly the arguments that you just put up, especially that this is actually only focused against migrants, this whole dossier that this commissioner has. So we are doing this. Maybe the ones not enough, and there are some who don't do it at all. But I mean, we really have to join forces. This is what I think we really have to do. We have to, the feminists, the LGBTI activists, the well, I don't know if we call, if I should say people of color. In Germany, there is a new way of putting it. They call themselves Neue Deutsche Organisationen, new German organizations. I have difficulties with this notion, but that's how they call themselves. Neue Deutsche Medienmacher, for example, people who are working in journalism. But we actually have to see that this is an attack on human rights at its roots. It's against respect for every person because one is a person, and that is why I think we should really have to focus. I mean, Poland and Hungary, the governments have started, but it is infectious. We see that Slovenia now is going the same path, exactly the same path. They're using the same mechanisms, and we are seeing other countries that are in danger to get into that same loop. And I think we have to be absolutely clear on this, all of us. And I mean, I tried to convince the more conservative parts in the European Parliament, which is a lot easier than convincing parts of the Commission or the Council. But still, this has to be the European fight against people who want to destroy this very basis of our values that are enshrined in our treaties. We have them in Article 2 and others.
Just on this point, I want to raise this point because it's something that I've noticed quite a lot, that the rule of law discussion or the issues that you've just raised, there's a very Eastern-centric focus on the rule of law, that the rule of law is under threat the rule of law and liberal values are under threat in Poland, Hungary, Slovenia now under the EPP Prime Minister Janša. But there are also very acute problems of the rule of law in Western Europe, but they absolutely get zero attention from the European Parliament, from the European Commission. We've already mentioned, there are various examples of the rule of law and threat on the EPP government of Austria. The Danish government is breaking international law and deporting Syrians back to a dangerous country, which is Syria. In France, there are examples of government politicians suing or launching legal defamation cases against political opponents during electoral campaigns. These are all very basic issues about upholding the rule of law, and it's also the fault, I guess, or a problem of the media. These are just not given any attention because there is almost a singular fixation that if the rule of law is going to fall in Europe, it's going to fall in Eastern Europe, but the rest of us seem to be immune to upholding these things.
May I reply to this immediately, because it's really my core fight. We have rule of law issues in all member states, in every single one, in different degrees. And we have last year for the first time, it's the Commission, who has for the first time emitted a rule of law report in every single member state, and they are going to do this every year to see where it becomes better or worse. We have I am myself a member of a rule of law monitoring group, which is associated to the LIBE committee, to the Civil Liberties Committee, and we have a look at, for example, freedom of press in a lot of countries and other issues, a lot of other issues, and we make them public also. Every 3 months we report to the LIBE committee. So there is a focus on a lot of countries in East and West, and in the South, not so many in the North, I admit. The point is, and it is an important point, we have these rule of law issues in every single member state, and we have to tackle them, no doubt about it. But at the moment, we only have 2 countries that want to change the concept of the rule of law. And that is a difference. And this is why we have to make a difference. It is a difference. The new narrative of the Polish and the Hungarian government since last year is you cannot define the rule of law for the whole of Europe. It's different depending on the culture and the history of a country. Now, you can say, of course, the way how you elect your judges and the way you organize your judicial system is different in every member state. That's fine, as long as you agree that in the end you have to have a separation of powers and an efficient control of governments. And they do not, if you have a look at what they do. So this, of course, please be vocal on what it happens in every member state. I am too. But please do not ignore this difference in dimension that we are having, because these people are not only destroying democracy in their own member state, they are trying to destroy democracy and redefine the basis of the European Union as such, and that is a difference, and we have to say so.
I guess the difference is that Orban and the Polish government are avowedly, proudly call themselves a liberal government, but that's not to say there's lots of illiberalism that goes around. Just because it's not called a liberalism doesn't mean it isn't. I think Evie's got her hand up, so she wants to jump in now.
Yeah, I don't know, Hans, if you want to jump in on the Eastern European discussion, because my point would go in a bit of a different direction. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's 3 things. So I heard you talking, Katarina Bali, about the European values, right? And I think this is also there where we come to the core of this discussion, like what values are we talking about? Where do these values start? Where do they end? For whom do they count and for whom not? And I think obviously in this round, we all know that we're talking about border politics, refugees, policing, many other things that happen, right? So I think it's a nice utopia, and I also like it. And if there's something I resonate with, it's this idea of the values. But I think when we see the European reality, I would question that. And I'm also there curious to hear about ways how to change that, and what do these values in the end mean if they end on a certain geographical notion, or if they don't count for certain people that have been made the other, right? So this is one point I wanted to make. And one other point, I think this joint forces narrative, I like it and I can resonate, but I'm also a bit triggered a lot of times, because I think it's also important to see who actually is under attack. And I think it's not white Europeans that are under attack, it's Black and Indigenous people of color that are under attack. And I think this is crucial to keep constantly in mind, to not forget about that, because when we're then talking about human rights and that they're at the core of our identities, human rights for whom, and who invented the concept of human rights, and for the rights of whom. And I think this is something that when we're talking about European identity, we shouldn't forget about, that this is the crucial point: who is under attack, and what are we doing to give space to these people, people of color in the end. And adding on that, and coming to a more like future vision, I think I shared it also several times, but I think this concept of giving space and sharing power and also rethinking the way institutions work is very crucial for that, because constantly we're talking about refugees or persons of color, but they're not there, right, in certain debates in many European institutions. And I think this is crucial to integrate, well, no, let's not use the word integrate, but I don't know, to integrate to where, but I think to make these perspectives more visible. And I think until Europe doesn't manage to do that, we have a problem here when we're talking about diverse futures for Europe, because I think a crucial point is that the perspectives of these persons that have been made the other by Europeans, by colonizers, need to become visible, and narratives need to change, and power structures need to change. And I think this should be at the core of European identity. But I think, and also, I don't know who it was, said that there's nothing to lose. I think there's something to lose, right? Because it's power. It's power that you give to persons that you took the power from. So I think it's also very sometimes romanticizing to be like, oh, there's nothing you lose. But I think to have the power to decide on words, on laws, it's crucial. And it's crucial for European identity. And I think to make the European identity more inclusive, we need to start giving visibility to these perspectives we're constantly talking about. And of course, our panel, I think it's a good start, but I think we spend way too much time analyzing and justifying why Europe has a problem with racism, right? I would wish, and then also coming back to a German perspective, I'm really tired about discussing, is racism now existing or not? Like, I know that racism has existed and many people proved it before. So what can we do about it? Because the German reality already is like moving towards a post-migrant society. So I think instead of constantly discussing, do we have a problem with racism? Does Europe have a problem with racism? The discussion should more be, what do we do about it? And what does it mean? And are people really willing to do what it actually means?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have too long left, and I'm aware that we've spent a lot of time talking about race, and maybe one thing that we haven't spoken about, which is religion. And I think perhaps something that I've been observing quite a lot for many years, I think, is one of the most pernicious and widespread forms of racism in Europe, which is Islamophobia. And the way that I have detected Islamophobia is very much the racism of liberals and progressives, because it really exposes the fragility of this idea of intersectionality, particularly because the far right in countries like Germany, but also Netherlands, and now also in France, has successfully used progressive values to paint Muslims as the other, because Muslims don't like gays, because Muslims don't like women's rights. They can never really fully be part of European values. And that's also done a huge damage to causes of intersectionality, because there probably are some parts of the LGBTIQ community who see Muslims as a problem, or members of the Jewish community in Europe who believe that, anti-Semitism is the monopoly of Muslim communities. So it's done a huge amount of damage, and it's become a very pervasive way of thinking. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to give each of you maybe a minute to have some final words of maybe thinking about where these debates go in the future. Hans, maybe I can start with you. I don't want to chip in, but my perspectives are I'm not so optimistic that people in power are really grasping with the complexities and the nuances, and a lot of things seem to be going backwards. But how do you see it from here on in?
No, that's exactly my perspective too. I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic, precisely, and I feel like it's a bit of a shame that we haven't really discussed this more this evening. I feel there is a really problematic turn in the European Union going on. This civilizational turn that I've described, and as I say, it's to do with the increasing power of the far right. And that brings me to, I guess, the main thing that I wanted to say to conclude, which is, I just really think the biggest danger here is to slip into this kind of very binary thinking where, it's liberals against illiberals, it's centrists against populists. This is too easy. It's really easy to beat up on the far right. What I'm worried about is, I think, what you sort of hinted at, Mehreen, which is how some of these far right tropes are being taken over by mainstream parties. That's what I'm worried about. And that's the discussion I sort of wanted to have amongst us, because as I say, it's super easy to blame, you know, the Hungarians and the Poles and, you know, the AfD and far right groups. That's too easy. And I think you know, we need to sort of examine our own blind spots, I think, a little bit more. And by the way, on that, I think my understanding of the arguments that Law and Justice makes on the rule of law are much more complex than was being suggested. You know, their argument is not, you know, we don't believe in the rule of law. Their argument is, you know, the EU's attempts to take action against Poland are themselves a violation of the rule of law, because it's an arbitrary use of power that goes beyond what the EU is actually, the powers that the EU have. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but it's a much more sophisticated argument if you listen to the Polish foreign minister, Johannes Rau, for example. Sorry, Zbigniew Rau, I'm getting mixed up with the former German president. And then just maybe one final thing on this intersectionality question. I mean, we don't have time to get into it properly, but yeah, intersectionality doesn't just mean let's talk about gender and sexuality issues as well as race issues. That's not what intersectionality is. And I think it is important to go back to what Mary pointed out earlier on, which is it does seem to me there's something different in the context, at least of the European Union. There's something different about these race issues. That you know, issues around gender and sexuality, just like issues around the Holocaust, you know, collective memory of the Holocaust, have become incredibly central to the way that pro-Europeans think about themselves and what they stand for. So there's a way in which the same thing hasn't happened for race, and so I don't think it does us any good to kind of say let's sort of forget about all the differences between these different sets of issues. They are different, and we need to think carefully about how that plays out in the European Union.
Thank you, Katrina. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
After 1.5 years. Yeah, there's so much more to say. It's a pity that we don't have much time. I mean, as the one who is actually an active politician and trying to shape it, I don't have a choice of being more or less optimistic, because I think as long as we are aware and as long as we ask the right questions, there's hope that we can solve them. I do share the view of the blind spots, but in detail there would be so much more. I don't know if maybe when the camera is off we can still continue our debate, because there's so much more I would like to say and ask, because I do think that the European values still are absolutely defining for who we are and what we do. I think the refugee question is one that we need a whole evening of its own to discuss that. That is the black spots on the rest of the European Union. I completely agree. But when we look at how we actually live these values, I think we have to see that there are that there is attack from a certain side, and there is attack by ignorance. I think the danger of slipping into this. I think we have to adapt. I would really like to discuss this further, because at least for the German party, I would say that we are very much aware of this and fight it. I can't, of course, in a 400,000 people party, you can't speak for everyone, but I think that there is a huge awareness for this. Okay, I will leave it there.
Thank you. And finally, with Evie, how about you? I know you have to go as well, so maybe some final remarks.
Yeah, it's hard to have final remarks because I feel in the last round so many new topics have been opened, so I'm a bit struggling to make some final remarks. But I want to come back maybe to the Jewish-Muslim and layer we started discussing, because I think in Germany it's very interesting, or what we do also here in the city of Heidelberg at the moment is we have like a Jewish Muslim Bündnis. I forgot the word for Bündnis. Alliance. Yeah. And there was this campaign, right? And that we do not let separate each other from one another. And I think this is also very important, that of course this is anti-Muslim racism is a very crucial thing. And I think we already hear about, do we call it Islamophobia? Do we call it anti-Muslim racism? Already there, we can see the different discourses happening. But I think also there, we shouldn't forget that there are alliances between Jewish and Muslim people, for example, and that these alliances are really strong, and that they also offer different narratives. I keep coming back to narratives a lot because I feel that this is missed when constantly analyzing that. I think if we're criticizing the old narrative, we need to shape a different one. And in Germany, we have this term, it's called Leitkultur, which is like the German lead culture, where everybody is like constantly referring to and no one knows what it is. And of course, the debate started also with the turn you described, Hans, right? Like in 2015 and 2010, like this term got stronger because the German Leitkultur is in danger due to all the refugees. And I think there I want to quote Max Czolek. He's a German Jewish author and publicist, and he has this new concept. He calls it a Jewish Muslim light culture, leading culture also for Germany, to offer alternatives to this Christian Jewish leading culture. And I think this is what I want to end with, that we just sometimes have to see where are these different narratives, because I think they are there already and they're also lived in some spaces. And for me, the question is just how can we make this more visible, or how can we support these perspectives to become stronger, to not leave this debate to the right or to populists, because I think there are very interesting debates ongoing. They're just not heard and maybe not too easy to understand because they're complex, as Europe is and as probably identities are. So I think this need to constantly simplifying things is probably something we have to get rid of when we're talking about the future of Europe and how to include diverse perspective. I think it's then to get rid of simplicity and to accept that it's complex and that it won't be easy.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a really good final point about alliances and the slight irony of the fact that people think that Muslims, Jews and Christians are all on different sides, when in fact they all share the biggest of all common roots, which is their Abrahamic monotheism. So it shouldn't be too much of a psychological barrier to maybe bring these people together. But there we are. I think that's why racism makes these things much more difficult. I think probably the only thing that we might have really agreed on is maybe the need to do this again a bit later on and to talk about all the themes that we've only touched upon. So maybe if our hosts are listening and we'd like to do this again a few months down the line with all of us or a few more of us, it would be brilliant, and I'd love to take part. So my final job is just to say thank you for everyone for giving us their evenings. It's been a really stimulating discussion, and hopefully it's managed to tickle a lot of people's senses about some of these questions, which sadly don't seem to get too much prominence in the political space, but maybe this is one example of how we can start gathering momentum. So thank you to all of my panelists. Thank you for everyone who wrote in questions and who stayed engaged with the discussion. And of course to our hosts, the German Diplomats of Color. And I wish you all a good evening, and hopefully we can see each other soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehan, for your moderation and guiding us through this discussion.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.